What
You're
if you get
saying
stuck on an
like,
elevator?
go.
Do you ever think about that? That's happened too. Like, what if the elevator stops working and your patient is crashing? And for whatever reason, you don't have a patient that's intubated, or on that elevator is not someone who can intubate, or you don't even have that equipment. What do you do? There's been times where we jump on elevators and the O2 tank ran out because it stopped. The elevator stopped.
Oh my God.
And our oxygen was running out. What do you do?
Honestly, like
Welcome to the Shift Report.
welcome back, listeners.
Thursday.
It is Thursday. We are so thrilled that so many of you guys are following along our podcast, The Shift Report. We are nurses. We're both practicing nurses. Our goal is to give you guys valid, awesome advice, our experiences in the multitude of situations that we're in, both with Wasim in his ICU, rapid response background, and then myself with our the floor medical surgical background. We really want you guys to take something back from everything that we have
Right.
to share.
Yeah, absolutely. And more importantly, learn something, whether it's about some topic or just listening to some stories, learning from our mistakes. We make mistakes, well, not often, and they're not huge, but, we all do things that we later reflect on that we could have probably done better.
Right. I think each nurse is different in how they do things or the way they go about their day. And really just everyone's interactions with one another are slightly different. And it's nice to appreciate the way you do things versus the way I do things,
Yeah.
and how things work and how they don't work.
Right. And there's a big contrast, and that comes a lot with backgrounds. And for all you nurses out there listening, a lot of the discussions we have here are going to be beneficial for you in your own career. And maybe you guys have advice or tips that you can share with us if you think that we could have done something better. That's the whole idea of this podcast, is to kind of create a platform where there is an exchange of ideas, because without that exchange of ideas, we're all kind of stagnant. And that's what we're trying to, I guess, fight against right now.
Yeah, and move past.
Yeah, and move forward and grow and progress, right? Which kind of leads us into our episode this week, where we're talking about decisions I made personally as a nurse, how I reflect on those decisions, how I behaved or how I reacted to other team members or even the patient's situation at that time. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that can negatively affect or positively affect your patient's progression of care. So we'll start a little bit about some story time. This past week, we had a hell of a day.
Really?
I'm talking, it was probably the worst shift I have ever had in my career.
Oh, wow.
And
what happened?
So, the job that I'm part of is highly variable. You don't know what's going to be through those doors when you walk into a patient's room.
Okay.
It can either be a patient who is up and talking to you with a blood pressure of 200 systolic, who is still completely normal and doesn't look symptomatic at all.
Sure.
Or you can walk into a patient's room that's like guppy breathing, who needs to be intubated ASAP, right?
Yeah, that's scary.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I walked into.
No way.
He was completely like awake and talking to me, but it was in a situation where this gentleman had a very, very difficult time breathing. And I quickly had a live moment on our Instagram, actually, which you guys can follow us at Realist RN. There is no "the" because Instagram doesn't allow a "the" in front of our username. But I had a quick live moment right after work, and I do this rant session after work now. And if you catch that, some people say it's pretty funny, but it's just real. It's raw, right? Yeah. And I had just walked out from that, and I thought, man, this is something that we can definitely podcast about, because I think a lot of people probably are in situations like this, or a lot of nurses are in situations like this. So I walk into this gentleman's room. They called a rapid response, and he's just huffing and puffing, just, He's talking to me. He's awake. He's alert. He's oriented. He's wanting to have us talk to his oldest son. So he's completely cognitively there, right?
Yeah. So he knows what's happening. He knows what kind of situation he's in.
Yeah, absolutely. So before I get there, the nurses were great enough to draw some blood, and they drew an arterial blood gas, which I would have done too. And his bicarb was 4. It was 4.
What?
Yeah. So like, if you don't understand ABGs, like a normal bicarb is 22 to 26, right?
Right.
This gentleman's bicarb was 4. So immediately I'm like, okay, something's going on in his body other than his respiratory system, but his respiratory system is trying to compensate for some metabolic issue that he's having.
Okay.
In his case, it was like a renal problem, right? So he was having...
Was he a dialysis patient?
Yeah, he was.
Oh, okay.
I don't know the extent of his history because I literally just walked into the room, but he had the equipment or the lines that would suggest that he was a renal patient. So we walk in there, and immediately the RT shows up that's part of our squad, and I look at her and I'm just like, this gentleman needs to be intubated now, or he needs to be intubated as of like yesterday. Right. Okay. And she's looking at me like, I agree.
So what's the protocol that you guys have to take in order for a patient to be intubated? I know you guys don't, like as nurses, we don't do that.
Right. Well, at least not at our facility. I've heard stories of other facilities where non-physicians do intubate, but we don't. Our RTs do not either. But that's also because we're part of such a very large hospital that the resources are always there. Okay. So we actually got called for a rapid response in a non-ICU setting, right? We were actually in the intermediate unit. So we show up, and obviously we don't have the resources there. It's kind of like walking or working in the dark, right? You don't have the drugs, you don't have the resources, you don't have the physicians. The nurses are also not comfortable always in those situations either. So we have the ability to call rapid anesthesia. So I go ahead and make that phone call. It was a very short conversation on the phone. They said, this patient's not doing so well. I need your help. So they come over. The RT is like, all right, let's set up the room for the intubation. And I'm like, yeah, I agree. So we grab the suction. I get fluids going. We get all the intubation equipment. We get oxygen tanks, anything that they can need, right? And I also grab some drugs, but it's also IMU. So not all drugs are available. So I do as much as I can. I also notified them like, hey, we don't have drugs to intubate a patient here, to sedate them, to paralyze them for the procedure. So you got to bring all that. And he's like, okay, cool, I'll bring it. So they show up, right? And for whatever reason, after 5 or 10 minutes, the decision was made to move this patient to the ICU rather than to intubate that patient there. Now, I kind of understood where they came from. Like, I understood that it wasn't the best environment, but that's the reason my team exists.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
You guys are the ones who are there to kind of gauge what's appropriate at what time. Yeah.
So I kind of understood it because the patient had a lot of comorbidities that would have made a dicey situation even dicier had we done something and something went wrong. And that's completely okay. But it got me thinking, like, there are so many times out there that we work with these patients in situations and then move from one unit in what is a very large hospital to another unit in what seems like a different city. And they go that 5, 6, or 7 minutes in that transport in no man's land. And that's what happened to us. So this gentleman like loses a pulse. And I'm looking, he's still talking to me, but his pulse doesn't show up on the monitor. So I'm sitting there messing with his leads, recycling.
So did he have like a carotid, a brachial?
Well, he's a renal patient, right? So vascularly poor.
Okay.
So my guess is he's probably like a chronic renal patient. So I'm feeling a brachial carotid pulse. They're there, but faint. Okay. He's already huffing and puffing. His blood pressure starts to drop. And I'm just sitting there kicking myself because I'm like, damn it, I did it again.
Oh, no.
I put myself in a situation where that patient's stability was compromised when I could have pushed for that intubation in a more stable environment. And I get it. I understand. They want to move to ICU.
Right.
That's cool. I get it. That is our endpoint. I understand that. But there is a long hallway, a long transport that needs to happen before that patient gets there. In that hallway, it's you, the respiratory therapist, anesthesia, maybe the primary physician, maybe you have someone helping you push the bed, but there is no crash cart in the hallway. You may or may not even have drugs in the hallway.
Yeah, and you just said, like, in the IMU setting, you didn't necessarily have the drugs to begin with that you may need in order to intubate this patient. And now you're in a long, dark hallway that you really have nothing at this point.
Yeah, now I don't even have a code cart, right? So if my patient starts to crash, I'm going to jump on the bed, start doing chest compressions, and just compress all the way to the ICU. But why get to that point?
Right. So what would you do, or I should say, how would you go about pushing to get this patient intubated at the bedside?
So sometimes that's a difficult position to be in as a nurse, right? Because I really respected these physicians, and I still do. You know, they made the best call for the patient that they felt was okay. And the patient ended up being fine.
Okay.
But my point is not that the patient could have, deteriorated in the wrong area. We were able to get to the ICU. He eventually got intubated. They were able to take care of him. But that's not the point, right? In that situation, I would have pushed more for some sort of stability. And this doesn't just go with my situation here. There are times where physicians will come in and say, oh, we need to take this patient to CT. And their blood pressure's in the tank. They're breathing really funny, like intubation funny. Their heart rate's all over the place, and they're just not stable. And I work in a teaching facility, so not every physician has the same level of experience. And throughout that experience, there are some challenges, or there are some situations where a physician might feel it's really, 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 really important to get that diagnostic scan, but may not realize that, hey, this patient needs to lay flat for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 minutes, depending on what study you're getting.
Right. And if they're having trouble breathing, lying flat is not ideal for them.
No, absolutely not. So I urge everybody, do not move your patients when they are unstable. Don't put yourself in a situation where you're in the middle of a hallway, or you're in CT scan or MRI or some holding bay for a procedure and your patient's crashing. Stabilize them first. If you need to move to the ICU to stabilize them, do that and then have them go for that scan. Right. There's too many people who are just working in hyperdrive, but not really understanding situations and environments. Yeah. And I was a victim of that.
Right. But
after having decades of experience, For
someone like me who's a bedside nurse, I wouldn't even know where to begin. Right. You have that ICU and that critical care background, but if I was in that situation and, say we called the code stroke and it's me and the hospitalist and one other person transporting the patient to CT and they start crashing, I honestly would not know what to do. I would freeze.
Yeah. And my best advice for people in your situation who don't have the experience in those situations is, I said situations twice, but if you don't have experience in those environments, I would suggest, 1, make sure your patient's breathing well. That means don't just look at the saturations. The saturations could easily say 100%, but look at how they are breathing, right? My guy was saturating 99%, but he was working so hard to keep up with that. It's not normal, Right. So don't monitor watch is 1. Look at your patient, assess your patient, do a head to toe scan. You don't need to go there and be like, oh, radial pulse, pull your pen light out. You don't need to do all. What's going on with your patient? What's the picture look like? Do you have a blood pressure? How are you maintaining that blood pressure? Do you have fluids running? Fluids don't always last. A bolus could, elevate your blood pressure, and then within 20 to 30 minutes, you could be hypotensive again. So do you have a blood pressure because of a fluid bolus, or is your blood pressure good? What's the heart rate like? Is your patient agitated? There's so many questions, right?
Right. So many.
Yeah. So always stabilize your patient first. And it's not just, I've seen this mistake in the hospital pretty often, but I made it. And it's because like I was, I guess, coerced by people around me to like move, when in actuality, I was the one who was like, oh crap, this guy's getting hypotensive on me,
Right. And so now you're shaking in your pants like, oh God.
Yeah. And everyone else is seemingly unconcerned because they're like, let's move to the ICU, and they're trailing. And I'm over here looking at this guy like, oh man, he doesn't look good. And I'm in the middle of a hallway.
So
what
you're
if you get
saying
stuck
like,
on an elevator?
Go.
Do you ever think about that? That's happened too. Like, what if the elevator stops working and your patient is crashing? And for whatever reason, you don't have a patient that's intubated, or on that elevator is not someone who can intubate, or you don't even have that equipment. What do you do? There's been times where we jump on elevators and the O2 tank ran out because it stopped. The elevator stopped.
Oh my God.
And our oxygen was running out. What do you do?
Honestly, like
Yeah.
that's so scary.
Always have a backup. You never know what can happen. And because of modern day medicine and modern day engineering, like we're taking elevators and, I've seen some of those floor escalators in hospitals, and it's crazy, man.
For sure.
And not always does equipment, last. That's why we always travel with an ambu bag. Always. Just because the patient's on BiPAP or intubated, you never know when your ventilator can go out. Right. You don't know when your O2 stops working. You can always ambu your patient. You know what I'm saying?
So what do you think like the solution is? So we have this, you have a patient and you know that they're not doing well, but at the same time, there are people who are higher than you saying, no, we need to do X, Y, and Z, but you really know that, hey, I don't really think that that's appropriate right now.
Right. So in that situation, and I've done it before, I would push them to really reevaluate their decision and give them X, Y, and Z reason. Like, no, we shouldn't move this patient because 1, it's a 10-minute walk to the new unit. 2, we have all the resources here. And 3, look at that patient. He's not going to last another 10 minutes. Sometimes they think about things in a very medicinal way, and that's okay. Like they get it. Like they know this patient has a little bit more time. They could probably make it, but they may not understand the logistics behind what goes into that. So that's something I think we as nurses are short-sighted about. Is that we just assume everyone knows what consists of an MRI. Right. A physician may order an MRI, but may not understand like the bed transfers, taking the patient down there, having to wait for escort, Yeah,
and MRIs take a long time. They have to be able to sit still in this machine that's loud. It's honestly kind of scary.
Right. And that's just one diagnostic, right? There's so many. So, sometimes just explaining where you're coming from can be the difference maker in how people react or take what you are trying to tell them, right? Don't just assume that people have all the information that's necessary, because that's not always the case.
And I also think a lot of it is like taking the time. In rapid response or high stress situations, everyone's moving 1,000 miles a minute. Right. And, everyone's shouting, hey, we need this or we need that. And I think it's important for us nurses to just take a step back and really let whoever is running the show kind of know the reason why you feel a certain way and really have that come across.
Right. And that's good. I'm glad, we're having this discussion today, because situations like this happen often. And it was a learning point for me too, and I've made this mistake before. And I've also told myself this very same thing that I'm sharing with our listeners today, but I still made that mistake. Yeah. And it's because it's difficult, right? You've got 5 people disagreeing with your point of view, but then they're also not the people that have to find those resources when things go bad.
Right.
Then they look at you like, hey, where's the crash cart?
Why didn't you do this? Or
where's the oxygen tank? Where's the ambu bag? And it's just like, man, I told y'all, just intubate him now, like stop wasting my time,
Yeah.
Let's do what's best for the patient. And in any situations where you're unsure, focus on your patient. When I walk into rapid responses, I don't care about history. I don't care about what patient was doing, blah, 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 blah. If my patient walks in and their blood pressure's low, my first thing, I'm fixing that blood pressure, right? If you want to spit out that this patient has heart failure, if this patient is a renal patient, whatever, in the back of my ear, cool. spit it out. But I'm doing everything I can to stabilize this patient. So don't move with unstable patients ever, period. Don't do it. Don't put yourself in a bad situation.
Yeah.
That's the rookie mistake. And I make it all the time. But I'm learning. It's been 10 years, but I'm learning.
I feel like that's all of us in, the multitude of situations that we're in, and we know better. And it goes back to like nursing school when all of your professors were like, trust your gut.
Right.
And that's what you have to do in these kind of situations. Or that's what I'm getting from you is like, if you know that something is wrong, trust your gut, stabilize that patient, communicate why you feel that way.
Right.
With the physician or anesthesia or whoever it may be, to just, take your time and communicate like, hey, I really think like this is more important than moving the patient at this time.
Right. Absolutely. Just keeping an open line of communication. That's 100% right. So, I mean, I'm glad we had this discussion today. I hope it helps. I hope it kind of puts things into perspective for people who haven't been in that situation or who are in that situation all the time. Just be smarter. Be more diligent about what you're doing. It's okay to make that mistake sometimes, but as long as you're learning from it, it's always a very, very good thing. I know next week we're going to be talking a little bit about social dilemmas in the nursing environment. That's
a good one.
We experience every day
to day. Social dilemmas.
Mm-hmm. Social dilemmas between patients, social dilemmas between visitors and families and other people. And we'll really harp on one specific topic that was kind of like eye-opening for me. Right. And I have never experienced that. And for me, it was more like, man, where do I stand on this? And it was really difficult, but that'll be next week. We'll go more into that. You want to talk about how they can find out more about our podcast?
Absolutely, guys. You can follow us. We're on Google Podcast, iTunes, Apple Music, Spotify, and at Instagram.
Right. What is our Instagram handle?
At Realist RN without the.
Yeah, because Instagram doesn't like the. We're also on YouTube, guys, so please comment, like, and subscribe our channel. There's a link below. We really appreciate you guys listening in. Check us out next week for our Social Dilemma podcast. It'd be really interesting. But every Thursday, something's going to drop, so be on the lookout. Thank you.
That's a wrap.
Peace.
The Shift Report.